Joining me now live from the United States, I'm delighted to welcome Douglas Carswell. Hi, Douglas.
Hi, it's wonderful to be on your show, and thank you for inviting me.
Great to have you on the programme. When did you first dream that Britain could leave the European Union?
I was in my early 20s, and I was one of those people who grew up seeing Britain, which had been on its knees in the 70s, revive under Margaret Thatcher. And there was this sense that Britain actually was able to manage its own affairs. And yet here we were being increasingly governed by the European Commission in Brussels. And in my early 20s, I came across someone my own age, a young chap called Daniel Hannan. And I remember talking to him and saying, you know, Britain and the European Union, it wasn't working. And he convinced me that not only did we need to leave the European Union, but that I should join him in helping make this happen. To give you some idea, at the time, this seemed such an outlandish idea that you could count on the fingers of one hand the number of Tory MPs who believed in it. And it was considered a very maverick, off-the-wall idea. But we made the case, we argued for it, we came to realize that the way to achieve it was to have a referendum, that in order to overcome the establishment, we needed a popular vote. And I think we came to see that actually that was right. Even with that vote, even with a referendum victory behind the Leave campaign, the establishment came very, very close to overturning that. So, you know, I got the idea with Dan Hannan and some others in the early 1990s, and it was a huge privilege to be able to stand for office and get into Parliament and help make it happen. It was tremendous. It felt a great sense of achievement when it happened.
You resigned your seat as a Conservative MP and then spectacularly were re-elected as a UKIP Member of Parliament. It was a bold move. Why did you make it? Why did you leave the Conservative Party?
Well, the Conservative Party at the time, if you remember, was run by the Cameroons, by people who talked Eurosceptic when they wanted your vote, but then went to Brussels and signed whatever was put in front of them. Now, many Conservatives have since adopted the idea of Britain being outside the European Union. In fact, they won a referendum with that as their central pledge. But under the Cameroons, we really did need to push them. And the only way I could try and push them was to join UKIP, was to make it clear that unless they conceded on the referendum, unless David Cameron committed to holding a referendum, he would no longer be Prime Minister. And so I joined UKIP, and I felt honour bound to get the permission from local people, because, you know, if I couldn't persuade them of the logic of the argument, we certainly couldn't win a referendum. So it was, to me, really a test case for the referendum. We were testing in Clacton, in one small slice of Essex, many of the arguments that we then rolled out across the country.
What do you make of the referendum campaign?
It was, when we look back, we forget quite what the referendum campaign was actually about. Both sides, particularly the Remain supporting media establishment in London, has tried to sort of reinvent and what people were voting for. People were voting for the idea that we could take back control as a country. People weren't voting because they felt a sense of, you know, xenophobic dislike of foreigners, or because they had a particular strong view on immigration. The fundamental premise was, should British people be able to decide their future under a government of their choosing? And that argument won the day. And we were told, if you remember, that, you know, that aeroplanes would stop flying and it would be impossible to import enough food to make a chicken sandwich, we were told at one time. David Cameron at one time even suggested there might be World War III if we voted to become a self-governing country once again. I think actually now, looking back, many of the arguments against Brexit were just hyperbole. They were absurd arguments put forward by an intellectually and morally bankrupt establishment that had become so used to holding office, it didn't really know what it was in power to do. So we I think, won that argument with the support of ordinary people. But, you know, I think the process of actually renewing the British political system, that is still very much a project underway. But Brexit allows us to do that. Now that we're a self-governing country, we can sort out the way that we're governed as a country. Because frankly, I don't think Britain is run as well as we should be run.
You and Nigel Farage of this parish shared a common goal, which was the departure of the European Union, the UK from the European Union. Did you fall out with Nigel?
Clearly, there were differences in our approach to winning elections. I remember during the Clacton campaign, I felt very strongly we needed to appeal to people who hadn't got a particularly strong view of Euroscepticism. And I think the fact that I won my seat in the 2015 and no other UKIP MP did perhaps vindicate the approach. We similarly tried an approach that appealed to the centre ground to win the moment for Euroscepticism during the referendum. And again, I think we proved the legitimacy of that approach. Clearly, Nigel had a different approach, but I don't think anyone should ever think negatively about Nigel's achievement. I mean, what he did was extraordinary, and he did it without ever winning a seat in the House of Commons. He did it being vilified by the established media, and he did it, I think, for totally selfless reasons. And I think it's extraordinary that today he has not had more proper acknowledgement from the political establishment for his phenomenal achievement. I think he deserves a tremendous amount of respect and admiration. Even people who spent their careers opposing him, I think, need to recognise the fact that he acted successfully and he's acted in what he believes is the best interest of the country, honourable and good and decent reasons.
So your differences with Nigel Farage were rather more strategic than personal?
I would say even just tactical. I mean, it's no secret that when you're trying to run a referendum campaign, you're going to have strong differences of opinion. You're going to have a clash of ideas. But I think actually it was a creative tension. I don't know if you saw the movie that portrayed Dominic Cummings and various tensions during the campaign. In my opinion, those were creative tensions. And it's because of those creative tensions we actually got the Leave side over the line. It was very, very close. But for all the noise and the infighting that there was at times, we had that process of differences of opinion in order to create a more effective campaign. The Remain campaign, they all agreed with each other, and look what they did. They fell flat on their face.
Now, Douglas, we left the European Union. What were your emotions on that fateful morning in 2016 when the result came through?
It was an extraordinary emotional moment. Even just thinking about it now, I slightly sort of well up. I had decided to dedicate much of my adult life to trying to achieve this. I was prepared to give up my position in the House of Commons, to risk everything in order to try to achieve it. And when we did it, I felt this sense of deep down utter exhaustion, but a sense of elation. I felt that I could turn the page and go off and do something else with my life. I went into politics not because I wanted the letters MP after my name, but because I wanted Britain to leave the European Union. And having achieved that, I felt I could leave politics voluntarily on my terms. And I felt this incredible sense of honour, privilege, that I was able to actually leave politics having succeeded in the one thing that I set out to achieve.
Douglas, a politician that got something done. I used to be a researcher in the House of Commons, and I was just struck by how incredibly powerless so many MPs seem to be, and they enter the House of Commons with the dream of changing the world, and yet they just come up against other politicians and bureaucracy and civil servants and all of the rest of it. Can I ask you whether you rate Boris Johnson's deal with the EU?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, let's be honest. Theresa May and some of her flunkies had made such an appalling mess of things and signed such a catastrophically in deal. And I think there should be real anger still directed at the Theresa May administration. The sheer crass incompetence of her and her advisors landed Boris Johnson with an extraordinarily bad hand. He's played that pretty well. I still have some concerns about the situation with Ireland, and I hope we can reach a reasonable agreement with Ireland. We want to have good relations with our neighbours, and I think that's really, really, really important for us as an independent country. Similarly, with France, I don't like any of this stuff about we're getting tough and sending in the navy. But want to be good neighbours. That's why we've left the European Union. Instead of being Bolshevik tenants, we're now going to be good neighbours. And that means fixing Theresa May's mess, but doing it in a way that actually allows us to have good long-term relations with the neighbours.
Can I ask you about your relationship with Dominic Cummings? Are you still in touch?
Yeah, Dom's a good friend. I've known him for over 20 years. I'm on texting terms with Dom. I haven't been in touch with him for a while, but I think he's a great guy, and rather like Nigel, I may have had my differences of opinion, but I don't think we could have done it. Dominic, Nigel, Hannan and Matthew Elliott are the indispensable people in giving us Brexit. I mean, I've met lots and lots of people since the referendum to tell you how central they were to the campaign. I think actually Dan Hannan, Dominic Cummings, Nigel Farage and Matthew Elliott were the four indispensables. And frankly, the rest of us, I know you were very generous in your interest, but if the rest of us hadn't existed, Brexit still would have happened. Those four people who made it happen. Dominic's one of them. But like many creative people, you get creative differences of opinion, and that's Dominic's great strength, but also perhaps one of his weaknesses.
Douglas, what do you make of Dominic Cummings' excoriating criticism of the Prime Minister since he left Number 10?
I'm very sad because I like Boris. I get on well with him personally. I like Dominic. I get on well with him personally. And I think actually history will look back at the referendum campaign and Vote Leave and see them as having joined to correct a 40-year error. And the consequences of that achievement, I think, will be extraordinary, and it will be seen as a world historic event. I think it's really sad that they've been bust up since, but I try and stay friendly with everyone. There's a greater cause in this than what somebody did or didn't say on their blog post last week.
I mean, do you think he should still be at Number 10? Was he the right man for the job, in your view? I mean, I know that he's a friend of yours, but do you think somebody of his nature, his mercurial nature, was appropriate for being the Prime Minister's chief advisor?
I can't really speak to that, but I would say this. I spent a lot of time during the referendum campaign going around trying to calm things down and trying to make sure that the people that we had hired, Matthew Elliott, Dan Hannan and I, hired Dominic for the role, and making sure that he was able to do it, but also making sure that he did it in a way that didn't antagonize and alienate. Everyone needs a boss. Every CEO of every campaign needs a tough board of directors. And I think we're now, perhaps in the first version of history, in the first analysis of the referendum, people didn't quite understand the extent to which it was some of the wiser heads around Dominic that actually made sure that the campaign got across the line. Every great CEO needs a great board behind them, and Dominic perhaps didn't have a board behind him, reining him in Downing Street, and sadly that had consequences.
Does that speak for a certain lack of leadership from the Prime Minister Boris Johnson? I know you're fond of him, you've spoken of him in glowing terms, but how do you rate the Prime Minister? Do you think that Boris Johnson is the right person to help us navigate the choppy waters post-pandemic?
Do you know what I think this shows? I don't think this reflects badly on Boris Johnson at all. I think it reflects really badly on a really fundamental structural problem. We have the Prime Minister, the leader of our country, holed up in a townhouse in Westminster without a senior department, a big department around them. We need a fundamental restructuring of Whitehall. The Prime Minister needs to have his own department, and there needs to be a really big... If you were in the White House, you could call on senior legal counsel. If you were the President of France, you could call on the resources of an entire department around you. I think what's happened is we see that the departments around Downing Street can, in effect, overwhelm Downing Street and make it quite impossible. It's like trying to sort of, drive a huge piece of equipment with a tiny little steering wheel. And I hope that if anyone in Downing Street or Boris's team is watching this, it's not Boris that has the issues. It's the fundamental, the wiring in the machinery in Downing Street is fundamentally broken and needs to be replaced and renewed and changed. There needs to be a complete overhaul of Whitehall. One of the great tragedies of the bust-up between Dominic and the Prime Minister is that I think it's pushed that agenda back. I think for this administration to succeed, it doesn't so much need a new cabinet, it needs a fundamental shake-up of the structure of Downing Street and the Cabinet Office.
And finally, Douglas, what about those who feel politically homeless? You said that as you left politics, you wanted to deliver Brexit. Well, it happened, but you also talked about a seismic change in our entire political life and the nature of politics in this country. Do you think that the Conservatives and Labour, that idea of a two-party state, can continue indefinitely, or do you think that a third force will come along at some point? What's your prognosis for the future of British politics?
You know, so often in politics it feels as if the same ideas and the same proposals have been governing us from irrespective of which party is in office. And I think there's a fundamental failure in the British body politic to allow a true competition of ideas and people. Too often, the House of Commons is dominated by third-rate special advisors or former special advisors who are parachuted into safe seats, who show obsequiousness to the whips and get promoted. We need a fundamental shake-up. I'm not sure if a new party is the way to do it. What I do think is we need far-reaching political reform. I'm here talking to you from the United States, and one of the things that I find so refreshing about the American system is there isn't really one system at all. There are 50 different systems. And this means that the United States is able to innovate and create new ideas. There's simply no one person in Washington who's deciding how to respond to COVID. It's a decision taken at state level. Here in Mississippi, what we're doing is very, very different to what they've been doing in Massachusetts or Missouri. And that is what allows America to be so successful. So I think far-reaching radical decentralization. Britain must never again be in a position where someone like Matt Hancock can stand in front of a camera and dictate to tens of millions of people whether they're allowed to hug their grandmother. You can't be a successful society and be run that way. It simply won't work. It won't work for fighting pandemics. It certainly won't work for all the other things that require sensible judgment and decision-making. So far-reaching radical decentralization and a scaling down of the size of government. Government in Britain is fundamentally too big. That's why whoever's in office, you're never going to get a good deal for the taxpayer from it. It's a huge machine that is basically looking out for its interests, not the interests of the British people. So smaller government, radical decentralization, and the restructuring of Whitehall. That's urgently and desperately needed.
Douglas, 3 words. Please come back.
One day. Thank you so much.
Well, look, I know we can't compete with the fabulous natural landscape of Mississippi. It's been brilliant to have you on the programme. Douglas Carswell, former Conservative and UKIP MP and the co-founder of Vote Leave.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.